Hi, everybody. Tom Simmons and the Priest in the Hot Seat podcast. What are the lost Gospels and why weren't they included in the Bible? A friend asked me this question recently, and I did a little bit of research that I'd like to share with you. The lost Gospels were a trove of ancient documents that were lost, obviously, right, until they were found. In 1945, in the Nag Hammadi Desert, it borders Cairo, when farmers dug up this sealed jar full of ancient scrolls in Egypt. Kind of like the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were first found 2 years later over in a different desert around the Dead Sea in southern Judea in 1947. These Apocryphal Gospels are ancient texts about Jesus that were not included in the official biblical canon. That's what apocryphal means. And they generally reflect a Gnostic, kind of a mystical viewpoint, which is why they're often called also the Gnostic Gospels. These date from as early as 100 AD to about 250 AD. That's their window of time. The Gospel of Thomas is thought to be the earliest, and you've probably heard of that one. It's one of the most famous of the Gnostic Gospels. It's a collection of 114 sayings that are attributed to Jesus. It contains no narrative like the Gospels do, and these sayings have a strongly Gnostic, mystical feel to them, emphasizing secret knowledge. That's what Gnosis is. It's knowledge that leads to spiritual enlightenment. The last in this group of Gospels is the Gospel of Philip. It's a kind of a sacramental text that describes how they prayed and worshiped. And it's famous for discussing a very close relationship between Jesus and Mary as kind of a symbol of divine pairings, which they see in this ontological extension of being in the mystical realm. And in between those, the earliest and the latest, Thomas and Philip, there's the infancy Gospel of Thomas. There's a proto-evangelion of James. There's the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Truth. And most of these date from the mid to late 2nd century, so like 180s into the early 3rd century. And the problem with these Gospels was that they showed up about 100 years too late. By the mid-2nd century, the church around the Roman Empire already had her Gospels. They were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. By the mid to late 2nd century, Christian congregations already had their lectionary readings, like we do at St. Peter's here, Sunday after Sunday. They'd been doing those readings from the Old Testament, from the Psalms, from the epistles, and from the Gospels. They've been reading those for generations. By the time that these Gnostic Gospels started being written, the church already knew the apostles' teaching and fellowship, the breaking of bread and the prayers, as Luke describes early in the book of Acts. By the mid to late 2nd century, Christians already knew Jesus, and they could tell the difference between the Jesus from the eyewitnesses, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the Jesus portrayed in these new Gospels. So when Christians encountered these texts, they caught a whiff of strange doctrines. And they already knew these false teachers because they'd been dealing with these ideas, these hybrid ideas, for years. Now, the modern mindset, when we find a treasure trove of documents buried in the desert, we imagine a very diverse church in the early centuries that had many different Christianities, each vying for influence and dominance in the ancient church. In Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, we can imagine a conspiracy by the majority faction of the church to suppress the Gnostic Gospels in some fashion, in some factional power play within the early church, right? I mean, that's kind of the narrative that has greeted the discovery of these texts in our world today. A lot of us are influenced by a Marxist mindset where there's always a constituency that wants to side with the oppressed, the underdog minority, in this case, of course, the Gnostics, and to recover and amplify their voices against that kind of hegemonic church that was trying to force them out. But, I think there's a different way to think of why Christians in the 2nd century would leave these texts, would just leave them be, because they experienced themselves as being in ground zero of a spiritual war. And the weapons that they faced, that they suffered under, were coercion and subversion, all right? The coercion is obvious in the persecution, the violence that oftentimes they're Jewish synagogues and then later Roman authorities wielded, trying to destroy and marginalize Christian communities. But it wasn't just coercion that they faced. There was also subversion, which is far more subtle. Jesus warned repeatedly of false teachers who would rise up. So did Paul. Acts chapter 20 is a great example, or Galatians chapter 1. In the book of Colossians, in the pastoral epistles, he's warning Timothy and Titus about false teachers. Peter did the same in his epistles, as did John in his epistles. The first century church, on almost every page of the New Testament, was acutely aware of the danger of false teaching that seeks to change the Christian story, to mutate Christian faith into something else, something that it was never intended to be. Christians, in this context, live and die. We live and die by our story. And you change the story, you change the faith, you change the character of God's people. And earlier generations of the church worked very hard to keep that from happening, to keep that tradition, the teaching of Jesus, whole, free of distortion. They kept all the artificial ingredients away and hybrid ideas like Gnosticism. Folks, if you like the Priest in the Hot Seat podcast, I ask you to do two things. One, send it to a friend, because that's how these things go viral. And two is, if you have a question that you'd like me to try to answer, then put it in the comment section below. Thanks, and I'm really glad to have you here. Okay, so Gnosticism is a form of Eastern pagan mysticism that says, yes, Jesus is divine, and so are you. They believe that God saves us by helping you develop how to unlock your inner divine through secret knowledge, through a path of enlightenment. Okay? These are familiar, right? It lives on today in many forms under many different names. Can you see how different, subtly different, that message of salvation is from the Christian message of salvation, which says that our salvation comes from the outside. It's not something that we awaken inside. It's something we receive by grace through faith in the forgiveness of God. That Jesus won for us by living a perfect life, by dying that horrendous death, and then by walking out of the grave, by representing us before the Father, which we receive by faith. We live by faith. We obey. So this kind of mysticism, it predated Jesus, but when they heard about Jesus, they were drawn to his power, to his person, to his story. And of course they would be, because he's the most compelling human being that has ever lived. They wanted to appropriate Jesus into their mystical system because they wanted to have his cachet for their ideas. So they ended up changing the story of Jesus into a hybrid that melded with their beliefs. It's called syncretism. But the result is a very different Jesus. They chose names of his closest associates to give these gospels clout, Thomas and Philip and Mary Magdalene, Peter. But the apostles in the first century and their successors after were not going to let that happen in the churches. So and here's what they did. As the apostles were aging, as they were facing increasing threats of death, as they approached their transition from the scene, so to speak, in the 50s and 60s AD, they made sure to pass on the genuine story of Jesus to the next generation. So they wrote the Gospels, and they passed it on to the next generation, who then in turn passed it on to the next. And Paul said this straight up to Timothy in his second epistle to Timothy 2, warning of false teachers. He said to Timothy, he says, what you have heard from me in the presence of all these eyewitnesses, I want you to entrust that message to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. So you see that passing it on from the apostles to the next generation to Timothy, who then pass it on to the next generation after them, and on and on. Paul did the same with the elders in the city of Ephesus in Acts chapter 20. In the face of false teachers, he urged them to protect and propagate Jesus' gospel as their top priority. And here's how they did it. They established a chain of custody within the apostolic era, and then continue. So from Paul to Timothy, and then continuing after that into what it's called the sub-apostolic period. And I want to name one in particular, one very important figure. His name was Irenaeus of Lyon. He's from France, what we now call France. It's in Gaul. He wasn't from there. He ended up there. Irenaeus was a disciple of a man named Polycarp. And Polycarp, well, he was the disciple of John the Apostle. So what John taught Polycarp passed on to Irenaeus. And Irenaeus wrote a book in the year 180, thereabout, 180 AD, called Against Heresies. And no subtitle needed, right? It's a 600-page long going after the teachings of the Gnostic sects that were trying to infiltrate and influence the teaching of the church. 600 pages in which he in which he quotes from writings that very closely resemble what we found in Nag Hammadi in 1945. Now, I want you to notice that date, 180 AD, all right? That's when most of the Gnostic Gospels were being written and circulated, and Irenaeus dealt very systematically with those ancient Gnostic teachings. And Irenaeus also was notable, for many things, but he was one of the earliest gospel lists, all right? You know what a gospel list is? Well, we hear it all the time. You look in your table of contents of your Bible, the Gospels are what? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, it would sound really strange to say John and Luke and Mark and Matthew, wouldn't it? That just doesn't sound right because, well, it's a gospel list. And Irenaeus was one of the earliest extant gospel lists that we have to this day. There were a number of other gospel lists from Syria, from Egypt, from Greece, from Italy, and of course Irenaeus ended up all the way in the west in Gaul, in the town of Lyon. All right, so that geographic spread everywhere, every time you have a gospel list in these first 2 centuries of the church, they're always the same. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You never see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Thomas, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You never see any variation to that list. It's the same authors, it's the same order. They were never lost, and there's never any confusion about who they are or where they came from or whether or not we should believe them. So I think that if you went back to the first century or the second century, second century congregation in any of those regions of the Roman Empire, and you went in there one Sunday and you asked the Christians in any of these churches, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they'd be like, yeah, of course. And then if you ask them, well, why did you pick them? All right, which is kind of a funny question, but it's basically the question that is raised by these apocryphal gospels, these Gnostic gospels. And I think they would probably say that, well, these books are what we received from the apostles. They would name their bishop and the bishop before him and the bishop before him and the bishop before him, and they could name all their bishops back to whatever apostle came and planted their church in that region. And they might say, so pick them? No, we just received them from the apostles. So I guess a good way to summarize and conclude, wrap this thing up, would be to say, asking the question, why did you pick those gospels, would be like asking, why did you pick your parents? Now, if you like this episode, hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell so that you know the next time we drop a Priest in the Hot Seat episode. And help us make this thing go viral by sending it to your friends. Thanks, and God bless you.